I like your bright yellow couch.
Thank you.
Nice.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Welcome and good afternoon, wherever you're at from part of the country. If you're morning, afternoon, thank you so much for being here today. My name is Angela Castellanos, and I am your moderator for today's learning session. And thank you again for taking the time to participate with us today. And we hope that this is going to be a fantastic learning opportunity for you as well. So I know that you cannot see where you're from. So we actually, Dr. Laura Minero and myself, we would like to know where everybody's actually joining us from. So please go ahead and write in your name and your location of where you're from, and we will get started shortly. Thank you so much.
Please also include your pronouns. You could do that by renaming yourself as well.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for doing that. Welcome again. So we want to make sure that this is going to be a very interactive opportunity for you today, this afternoon. It's been such a fabulous conference so far. I've had such an opportunity myself to be jumping into different locations. And we have Sandra from Garden Grove. Welcome, Garden Grove, California. But we want this again to be a very interactive learning experience for you. We're going to be encouraging you to participate through the Zoom using emoticons. Feel free to engage with us as well. We want to also remind everybody that your microphones are off and the session is being recorded. And as well, we're going to be putting in the information as far as like the slide deck and also any handouts for today's session. We're going to put it in the chat as well. And at the end, we're also going to be inviting you to participate in filling out a survey for us, because we really want to know what your experience was like today. Next, the previous slide, please. This training is offered through the Crisis and Recovery and Enhancement Technical Assistance Center, which is funded by the California Department of Healthcare Services and administered by the Center for Applied Research Solutions. The views, opinions, and expressed in this presentation do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or policies of the California Department of Healthcare Services. In the case of any security issues that may occur, the session is going to be immediately terminated and will not resume. A separate email will be sent to all the participants for further instruction. Next slide. Like I mentioned earlier, we want this to be a very interactive session for you, and you are welcome to use the chat box to message the speakers. There is going to be an opportunity for question and answer at the end of Dr. Laura Minero's presentation today. And so we're going to take an opportunity to do that. So again, write in your information in there as well. Please use I statements in the chat and avoid making any comments that are stigmatizing or otherwise injurious towards others. If you do not want to engage in the chat feature, you can minimize the chat box and just sit back and just enjoy the conversation today. You can also make sure that if you need to take a break as well, because we want this to be as well as a safe space for you. You would like to go to a quiet place within the conference for self-guided grounding, please exit the session and go to the exhibitor booth and calm space. Next slide. Now that we got that out of the way, the housekeeping stuff, we're very excited to have with us today Dr. Laura Minero, and I'm going to just pass it on to her.
Thank you so much, Angela, for that wonderful introduction, and welcome everyone to the space. Thank you everyone for being here. I know we have some amazing concurrent sessions going on, so thank you for being here today. I have a couple of things that I want to say before I get started. So I first want to acknowledge the past and current Tongva Indigenous communities whose stolen land I presently inhabit. It is important for me to also acknowledge that Indigenous folks and communities have long honored and celebrated two-spirit and gender expansive individuals. So while the title of my presentation and the terms I use today are primarily transgender and non-binary, I want to make clear that this includes two-spirit communities who have long resisted on the very lands that we presently inhabit, particularly against colonization. So today, I'm going to be sharing with you some of my work from my own dissertation, which I completed last year. And I always like to start off by acknowledging my own accesses of power and privilege. my own accesses of oppression. And I have this quote here. As someone who, I myself am undocumented, I came to this country at the age of 5 with my parents. We have all been undocumented, and you actually see us here in Mexico about a year before actually immigrating to the United States. And so my experiences are very much influenced by, what it's like to be treated as an undocumented immigrant in the US. I'm also queer and gender expansive. And so I feel like my experiences are very intimately intertwined with the individuals that I got to interview as part of this study. And so I feel like I hold great responsibility for making sure to honor these stories, making sure that people are represented how they wish to be represented. And I want to, one of the most important things I think is important for me to say, and this was my positionality in the conduct of the study, was that I did not need to conduct this study to know that detention is harmful. I've known that, my family has had experiences with that. The communities that I work with and serve have had experiences with that. So I do not believe that I needed to do this study to prove that. I already knew that. I simply wanted to learn more about these experiences and also contribute to creating a rigorous scientific study that can be used to further advocate for the abolishment of detention. So I want to make it clear what my positionality was in conducting the study from the very beginning. And I also want to say that my work stands on the shoulders of not only my own ancestors, but also trans, non-binary, two-spirit individuals who have long been resisting against these systems of harm and oppression, particularly detention. There has been BIPOC trans leaders at the forefront. Scientists have a long way to go. Research practitioners have a long way to go in catching up to the work that these leaders have been doing for a long time. So I do want to say that I do feel like others have the privilege to learn about and study discrimination and oppression without experiencing it their entire lives. For me, I find myself at various intersections of oppression while simultaneously using my privilege to shed light on these injustices and inequality. So some of the learning objectives for today, I'm going to be sharing what we already knew before the conduct of the study, some of which I just shared. We'll also be learning about Latinx trans experiences in their home country and during migration. We'll also learn about what their experiences were during US detention and the subsequent psychological impact of detention on these individuals, and also learn about implications for these findings, including a call for mental health and continuum of care services. So just to get a little bit back into what we already knew before conducting the study. So 1 in every 3 trans people is murdered every single day worldwide, actually occurring in America, which is why I chose to focus on this population. When individuals immigrate to the US seeking safety, the standard, the one route that people have is either coming in undocumented. So folks might end up in detention because they're in the US undocumented, and maybe they're stopped in some way, shape, or form. Or individuals might end up in detention because they showed up to the border seeking asylum or got caught somewhere in the border. And that is like so critical to this study, because we also learned more about how people end up in detention. But when folks are put in detention, trans immigrants are commonly housed by their sex-assigned identity. So this puts individuals at an increased risk for physical, sexual, and psychological abuse. We have known that trans individuals are held in detention twice as long as their cisgender counterparts. And they're also disproportionately placed in solitary confinement under the guidance that this is actually for their protection. So we'll get to that in terms of whether that's actually true or not and what we found in this study. I also want to name that detention we've known is harmful. I think a lot of advocacy organizations have named some of that harm. And in fact, in the last 3 years, we have had 8 individuals to our knowledge who are trans identified. This may be a huge understatement, as ICE does not track the gender identity of folks who have actually died in detention. So detention has actually been responsible for the death of our communities as well. And so I want to make sure to name that. There has been a clear link between psychological impact of detention and also being put in solitary confinement. So as you might imagine, immigrants come with prior trauma, and that trauma may be exacerbated during detention. So people's mental health may worsen as a result of being placed in detention. Prolonged conditions of isolation, such as that of solitary confinement, have been found to lead to substantial psychological harm and also irreversible damage. And yet this is common practice in detention and also in prison. That won't be the focus of this study, but I want to make sure to name that. And little is known about how coping and resiliency or resistance factors relate to the experiences with detention and post-detention, in particular for this community. So what did I do and what was the purpose of the study? Again, I've known, the communities I work with have known that detention is harmful, but we wanted to be able to conduct a rigorous study that would provide us with evidence of this harm so that we could advocate against this. So one of the things that I did is I reached out to a couple of trans and BIPOC, immigrant, undocumented, asylum-led organizations who work with this community and ask them what would be helpful for them. What do you want to know about this experience? And together we developed a semi-structured interview, and I was able to pay those organizations for their time. The other organization actually helped me recruit participants. So we created a 50-question questionnaire. They lasted between an hour to an hour and a half. The organization that I worked with actually gave me a room so that participants could come to an organization that they were already familiar with and share their stories with me. I actually used a grounded theory approach by Charmas, which allowed me to stick to participants' own narratives, own words. I'm going to be sharing that in a little bit, and actually construct a theory about what participants' experiences were. And what the community organizations really wanted to focus on was they wanted to know what people's experiences were in their home countries, what their migratory experiences were like, what their experiences in detention were like, how they were psychologically impacted, and then what their experiences were like after detention. This is the participant demographic. Participants were between the ages of 18 and 52, with the mean age of 23. And they immigrated between the ages of 14 and 39. So very diverse age sample. All participants were from Latin American countries, 40% from El Salvador, 23% from Guatemala, 17% from Mexico, 17% from Honduras, and we had 1 participant from Peru. All individuals were Spanish speaking, and I did all the interviews. I'm bicultural, bilingual, and so I was able to conduct all the interviews, and individuals preferred language, and everyone preferred Spanish despite knowing other languages. There were 27 individuals who identified as trans women or feminine, and there were 2 individuals who identified as non-binary, and we had 1 individual who identified as a man. And these are like participants' own words. One of the findings that we had that was really, really significant in this study was that participants were held as short as 1 day and as long as 3 years. And I do want to say that 1 day is an outlier, and so is 3 years. So the average length of time that participants spent in detention was actually 8 months. So this is significantly longer than the average immigrant might be held in detention. So cisgender individuals have been found to be in detention for about a month. This is 7 months longer than their cisgender counterparts. So I want to make that very clear. And And I'm sorry, my puppy's barking a little, so if you hear something, it's her. So here is a model that resulted from the interviews that we did. And you'll really see, I'll kind of walk us through it, and then we'll zoom into them and share some personal narratives that actually describe these themes a little bit more. So we have this model that I titled The Resiliency Against Trans Erasure of Latinx Trans Individuals. And one thing that I want to highlight about this is that participants were found to be immensely resilient and were actively resisting against the harm that they experienced, specifically transphobia and different forms of violence that they experienced throughout their lives, all along the different phases of this model. So in the first theme that we have, it's interpersonal and systemic transphobia in home country. So participants described experiencing significant family non-acceptance. They also experienced societal prejudice, prejudicial attitudes and discrimination, again, primarily centered on transphobia in their home countries. There was significant report of anti-trans violence, and many individuals described either having threats to their own life, so having survived attempted murder, or witnessing their friends being murdered who were also trans. So significant amount of trauma. And I also want to pause there because I'm realizing that I forgot to give a trauma trigger, a warning. So the things that I'll share today can be really triggering, and I want to be able to honor that and just kind of echo what Angela said, that if you need to take care of yourself, step away, please, please, please do that. And I know every time that I kind of walk into this, that's present for me as I share these experiences. So just to share an example, for many folks, having that family non-acceptance would lead individuals to becoming homeless and experiencing socioeconomic hardship. So that's how we get into the second theme, which is the impact of transphobia and violence in their home country. So how were people impacted by these experiences in their home country? As I mentioned, people might experience socioeconomic hardship due to lacking familial support at a very young age. The youngest that somebody was kicked out of their home was 11 years old, very, very young. There was also difficulties with mental health reality, right? So people were navigating all of this harm and violence, and of course, their mental health was subsequently going to be impacted. However, again, this is where the resistance and resiliency comes in. Folks were able to seek support. And one of the things that folks mentioned was really important was connecting to other trans individuals in their communities that they could relate to and also relied on for survival. This, of course, motivated people to immigrate to the United States. Some individuals in particular actually immigrated to other countries that were north of their own country. So people may have immigrated to Mexico first before coming to the US, but then were met with some of the same prejudices, discrimination and violence in that home country. So eventually they made their way to the US. And some of the main push and pull factors were the desire for a better life and feeling like they could live freely here in the US and have more opportunities that were not available in these other countries. So as we know, I think this is something that maybe is talked about, but we do know a little bit less about trans and non-binary individuals' experience. So participants did report having hardship and violence on their migration journey. And this is actually incredible because I've never seen this reported anywhere else. Something that was unique about these findings was that despite experiencing hardship, like many people left with zero money, had to leave from one day to the next. It was definitely not anything that was planned. They didn't even know which steps to take next, what route to take. Very stressful situation. People reported receiving assistance along the way. And this was a significant theme that came out as they were trying to immigrate to the United States. So you can see how this also lends towards highlighting the perseverance and motivation that people had to continue on their journeys. Also, this is something that we know very limited information about. So another finding from the study was that we got to understand how people end up and how do they get apprehended. So in our study, we found that there were 10 individuals who were seeking asylum at the border. And I said, literally, like the way policies work in the US, when you do that, when you present yourself at the border, you're automatically put into detention until they can interview you and determine if you can try to pursue asylum in the US. Some people were apprehended while migrating, so they didn't even know that they could seek asylum in the US. Individuals experience criminalization. And one of the things I want to highlight here is, if folks are here undocumented, don't have the ability to work, experience transphobia and discrimination, these were acts of survival. So many times in this category, people describe, stealing some food from a rancho market. And that is a form of survival. I think we really need to work on decriminalizing acts of survival. But this is eventually how some of these individuals ended up in detention. And also, people were wrongfully accused of doing sex work. There's nothing wrong with sex work, but people were stigmatized for their appearance and subsequently ended up in detention as a result. One individual was detained during a US checkpoint, obviously didn't have documentation, so that's how they ended up in detention. And then here's where we get into some of the core goals of the study, was to learn, right, what were people's experiences in detention and how did that subsequently impact them. So again, I just want to give a trigger warning. I'll share some narratives in a little bit, but participants described debilitating conditions in La Hielera. So this is what we call an ice box. This is how everyone referred to it, La Hielera. So La Hielera is a holding cell where trans immigrants are put before ICE decides which detention center a person is going to go to. So people's descriptions of La Hielera were horrendous. People described being held in this really cold, tiny cell, sometimes alone, sometimes with people, not being given any information, having no idea what's going on, these bright fluorescent lights on at all times, having no blanket and having the air blasting cold. And some people were detained in the river. So imagine being held in this icy cold room. That's why it's called La Hielera, after being cold, right? This is actually what has led to previous deaths in La Hielera and in detention. Participants described being disoriented, not knowing what time it was, and also being held longer in La Hielera than what the US ICE regulations state. So that was one of the findings. Participants also described dehumanizing treatment by detention authorities, being bullied, being made to feel less than, a lot of transphobic behavior by ICE guards. So once folks were in detention, sometimes having food thrown at their feet, sometimes even being given moldy food. And that gets into denial of access to basic human needs and medical care. The individuals that experienced violence on their journey needed medical attention and didn't receive that when they were in detention. And another thing to mention about this theme is that sometimes participants were actually over medicated. So a lot of participants described being given medication despite never being given a diagnosis. So many didn't even know what they were taking, but they described it as being given medication to relax because the experience of detention was just so immense and so traumatic for them. So that's what people thought they were being given. I had one participant report that she was given 11 pills and didn't know what any of them were for. So this is medical abuse and we need to name it. Individuals also described being placed in solitary confinement for various reasons, for punishment, for experiencing mental health distress. Participants would be placed in solitary. There was one participant who was actually raped by another person in detention after being put in a male cell despite being a woman. And she described that what she was told was, well, the only thing we can do is put you in solitary instead of, like dealing with the individual who was the perpetrator. They literally punished her and put her in solitary confinement. So really, really significant trauma and torture here. So I want to name too that some of these conditions are actually considered torture-like practices by the US government. And so we really need to name that US ICE and detention is actually using these torture-like practices detention when they're supposed to be here to support immigrants, especially after, experiencing so much trauma and wanting to seek safety and harbor in the United States. So participants, most of them describe this experience in detention as a nightmare, hell, the worst experience of their lives, isolating, and desgastante, which means like wearing, like really exhausting. I think this is important to name in the context of what I shared with you previously, that individuals had survived. So people had their lives threatened, had been kicked out of their homes, had seen their own communities murdered, and they described this experience as that. That's significant for us to name. So the psychological impact during detention, many participants, I think not surprisingly so, described symptoms of trauma, anxiety, depression was a big theme. People described having this uncontrollable sense of crying and being unable to stop, pacing in the cells back and forth, and just having a lot of anxiety about what was going to happen to them because information wasn't given to them, and they really didn't know, what their process would be in detention. Participants also described having suicidal ideation and at times a preference to self-deport because their experience in detention were so significant and so harmful. It's also important to name, right, that while people were experiencing harm, trans immigrants' resilience inherently helped them survive this terrible experience. So people described having both external and internal motivation to aguantar, to endure. So individuals described, I've come this far already. I know that I can get through this. Some individuals focused on the external, like, I know when I get to the US and get through this experience, when I get out of detention, it's going to be so much better. This lends into people feeling hopeful or having esperanzas for a better life after detention. And many individuals, I think this was also a significant finding, is that many individuals actually made meaning of their experiences through their faith and their spirituality. So this was a significant source of coping. Many saying, God is a witness to what I've lived through, and I wouldn't be in this experience if he didn't think I could get through this. So that was really, really significant. So we also asked about what participants' experiences were post-detention. So of course, there were psychological symptoms that people continued to experience after being released from detention. So I forgot to mention that I interviewed everyone from the study after they had already been released from detention. So people experienced trauma, fear, and anxiety. So what I noticed here was that there was not as many symptoms of depression present. There was a lot more like trauma, fear, anxiety related symptoms. You see this in people feeling vigilant, people kind of over accommodating their behavior. So remembering how they had to be ultra careful in detention. So kind of carrying that with them post detention. And people also described experiencing a significant post-traumatic growth. Again, really being able to make sense of their experiencing, seeing their strength and resiliency for being able to survive and get through this level of hardship, and just really being able to make meaning of their experiences in a positive way. Folks continue to cope post-detention by maintaining their faith and spirituality. People eventually connected to organizations that they felt like they could be seen by and supported by, and also eventually relied on some of the familial support they might have, and social support, and that was a significant source of coping for them as well. I also asked participants, what recommendations might you have for individuals post-detention? And the number one resource that came up, the number one recommendation by 60% of participants were mental health resources. Everyone said that these were significant considering everything that they had survived, and that they still continue to have difficulty connecting to services. So I actually connected folks to free pro bono services through the Mexican consulate. And that was part of my, like giving back to the community as we were doing the research study. But this is a huge deficit and something that we can work on. Legal resources were also necessary, even though folks may have been released from detention. Some folks didn't know what were the next steps in their case or how to prepare a case. So that was significant as well. And also like basic needs, like getting housing, getting food. Otherwise, right, the cycle gets repeated all over again and people may end up in detention again, right, as I mentioned earlier, because of the criminalization of survival. So I just want to share some quotes to kind of delineate some of these findings a little bit more. So these are pseudonyms to protect participants' identities, but this one delineates participants' experience in their home country, Honduras, on the theme murder of trans people. So Patricia, a 22-year-old female, says, yeah, because at least crime in my country is very hard. There are many assassinations of trans women. Yes, well, all the trans women that I knew, the ones from my town, all of them are dead because they were assassinated. Recently, some news came out that not too long ago, a trans woman was assassinated months later in El Salvador. It could have been me that they killed. So very significant, right? Seeing that a community that you're a part of is literally being erased, right? And I think you can sense her worry and that fear about deportation, right? Knowing that even when folks are deported, this is the fate that people may be met with. This individual, Alex, describes their experience in solitary as torture. Alex is a 25-year-old non-binary participant from Honduras who says, there were people who wanted to run away, who screamed that they were getting sick, and what would they do? They isolated them instead of supporting them. They took them to these rooms for solitary and they had them there for weeks. They ended up going more crazy. When they got out, they slept like traumatized, quiet, like without talking. They would not take them to a person to help psychologically or anything. Instead, it was more like a punishment. It's incredible that this sort of situation happens in this country and nobody knows about it. And I want to say this were participants' own words, and I know we're trying to just use the word crazy, so I want to name that. This was just a quote that a participant used. For denial of access to basic human needs and medical care in detention, Lupe, a 42-year-old non-binary participant from Mexico, says, they found, well, I was detained in immigration in 2017 and they discovered a tumor. So then immigration let me go. I knew that it was a tumor, but when I began to go to the hospital, there were actually 4 tumors in my head. And I want to share that Lupe was actually asking for ice packs and sharing that they had significant pain in their head. And it wasn't until they finally took them to the hospital. This was an individual that was in detention for 3 years that they found this tumor. And that's why, like, Lupa's interpretation of that was like, oh, they didn't want to take care of the medical costs, so they actually let me go. They let me go from detention. And it turned out, like Lupa said, that they actually had 4 tumors and they were cancerous. So Lupa shared this story with me. This is from the psychological impact. So suicidal ideation. Patricia, a 22-year-old female from Honduras, who we just heard from earlier, also shared, the segregation is very horrible because without being able to see the light of day and being locked up. One day, well, I took the decision that I didn't want to be there anymore, but they didn't want to take me out of solitary. And they told me, you are not going anywhere. So I slit my wrist with the reusable razor. I wanted to die or return to my country, one of the two things. So again, this really highlights, right, the significance of the torture and the dehumanization that people experience was so bad in detention that people preferred, in this case, right, to either take your life or to return to your home country. So these are very few snippets of the immense amount of stories that I had the privilege to learn about, to hear, to hold in my heart. I just want to share some of the conclusions from the study. And actually, one of the publications, I'm signing the author publication agreement and committing to making this article open access. So if you're interested in getting that after this presentation, it should be out in the next couple of weeks. I would be happy to share it with you. But some of the conclusions are that the model I shared posits that the various transphobia, femphobia, racist and xenophobic violence and abuse that Latinx trans individuals survive from their family, community members, strangers, along with US detention authority figures, is evidence of social and systemic erasure that they faced. These experiences of oppressive social systems and unequal social relations commonly led trans participants to countries and immigrate to the US. And regardless of how participants ended up in detention, results clearly indicate that the systems of power employed by detention proceedings and solitary confinement incurred psychological sequelae on participants. And we learned what that was. So in terms of implications, my call, which I mentioned earlier, is that we need to release all trans immigrants from detention and end cruel and inhumane detention facilities altogether. I think we also need to re-examine and reimagine and learn to rebuild asylum and refugee seeking processes in the US to normalize migration, right? And to really imagine what it would look like to decriminalize migration. And also to develop a continuum of care services for Latinx trans immigrants before, during, and after detention. I think we can see, right, the multiple points of interventions that we can think about here. And I actually hope we can get into a discussion about this as we kind of open it up for a Q&A. Here are some of my references. Again, I'm happy to connect offline, but I'd really love to hear people's reactions. I'm here for a conversation. So thank you so much for your time and your intent today to be here.
Thank you for that enlightening information. I learned so much myself. So thank you for that commitment and the bravery of your the individuals that participated in the study. So thank you so much for that information. I don't see any questions in the chat, so not sure if you wanted to kind of pose any opportunities right now for the audience to feel free to ask any questions at this point, and you can actually write that information in the chat and I'll be happy to share that information.
Yeah, and I think we may or may not, I don't know if we could have this, Michael, but I think I had requested that folks can have their camera on if you'd like. So we do have time. We have about 20 minutes. So I'd really love to engage us in dialogue, if that's via the chat box or if anyone has the ability to unmute yourself and ask a question. Someone said this is a very helpful document. Thank you for sharing the resiliency as well. I'm just reading some of the direct messages. And yes, Michael, I think that's okay. I think we have a small group. Even if we just have like reflections, it doesn't have to be a sentence. I mean, as a question. Someone said very powerful research. Thank you for sharing. I think I see Amanda came on.
Laura, I was just curious, how soon after they were released from the detention centers did you interview them?
Yeah, so that varied a lot too. And literally, I was able to interview someone who had just been released from detention literally like 2 days before. Mm-hmm. And that person was showing up for resources at the center, and they were interested in sharing their story. And then I think the longest that somebody had been out of detention was actually 10 years.
Wow.
So, and they still described this continued surveillance, this continued over accommodation, still remembering traumatic memories from their time in detention. So this is really significant to have such a broad sample.
Yeah, that's amazing. Amazing work. Amazing work. Thank you for sharing.
Thank you. It's all in community. I truly couldn't have done this without collaborating with our community members. And really, you know, our community is the one that's been paving the way for this work. I have a question here, so I'm gonna read it. How was your personal experience growing up, and how much or little were you able to relate to some of the people in the centers? Thank you for such a thoughtful question, Cindy. I think that I want to say it straight up. I think that made it hard because I felt like I related. Again, I'm someone who's gender expansive, also undocumented, has experienced surveillance, and yet I had privilege in that I've never experienced detention myself. And I was able to conduct these interviews with individuals post-detention, right? I need to name my privilege in that. I think my experiences growing up significantly impacted the work that I do today. And so I myself have, I have a distinct memory where I went to the train station with my mom one day. I was about 14, and we were picking up my grandpa who was coming to visit. And there was an ICE truck in the parking lot that pulled up right next to us. And I still remember like the feeling in my body, the images. I looked over to the right and saw the sticker on the white van that said like ICE. And my mom and I like just looked at each other. She like quickly like turned on the car and backed out of the driveway, and we drove away. I've never experienced that up until that day. And even though I've always had that fear of ICE, it became very real that day. Like they were 2 feet away from us. And I remember eventually my mom pulled over on the road and she stopped, and we just like bawled. We just cried together and held each other because that was such an intense, scary experience. So I relate in that way, right? And acknowledge, right? I think it was really important for me to name that there's a lot of violence, trauma, harm, torture that we don't name in these everyday lives. Like these are people's everyday lives, experiences that they've lived through, that they've survived, that they cope with every day. And we very, very often don't name, right, the harm that people have experienced because of systemic oppression. So I relate in that way. And I want to say that I think that also made me approach this in a very mindful and intentional way. I was able to compensate all the participants for their time, compensate my organizations who collaborated with me. I haven't put any of the burden on the organizations in disseminating the findings, but have included them in that process. And there were various times where I would just break down and cry. To be honest, I would just break down and cry, reading all of the harm the participants had experienced, knowing that this continues to happen. And there are some people who literally don't get it. There are people whose jobs it is, right, to cure this kind of harm, and it's institutionalized. And it became really overwhelming at times where I really would just put down my computer, lay down in bed and cry it out. And then the thing that kept me going was people need to know about this. And I was given these stories for a reason. So I need to get this out. I need to keep going. And knowing that like this harm will continue unless we actively name it, and do everything that we can to abolish and dismantle it. Thank you, Cindy. And I think this is why we need to create pathways for, for folks who are part of these communities to do this Any other thoughts, comments, reflections? Reactions?
I think for me, one of the things, I mean, that's, I know I'm moderating, but I think one of the things that stood out to me is, these the individuals interviewed were adults. And so I'm thinking about the children that are also coming over. And so some of the pieces that they also have to experience in these kind of conditions and situations. So that just kind of stood out to me and as a reflection as well.
Yeah, thank you, Angela. And I think that's like a unique thing. I think somebody actually made a comment about how people don't kind of empathize, right? Like they don't really see their loved ones in these situations, so it's hard to relate. And I actually think that's why it's easier for folks to have compassion for the children, right? That I think that that's gotten a lot of media attention in the last few years. And I think that that can also be detrimental, right? Because detention is harmful, period, no matter what age you're at, right? And I think sometimes by focusing on like, oh, it's horrible that children go through, it's like, it's horrible that anyone goes through this period, right? So yeah, I feel like sometimes this is just like the normalization of detention that we have in our country, right?
Great point.
I do want to share. I don't know if I don't think feel free to continue to talk in the chat or unmute yourself. We don't have to stay here if we want to end early. But I do want to share. I was the consultant for some LGBTQ resources. And so if you do want to learn about how to provide more trans affirming care, I provided resources through an intersectional lens. So those are actually accessible through the CARE website under the anti-racism and resources that are in there. And they've actually been tagged in the email. So just know that, if you want to follow up with resources, you can go to the website and get those as well. And please connect with me if you wish. Here's my email. I love folks, following me on Instagram, connecting to me in all the ways. Or tweet me, message me if you'd like. I'm always open to having more dialogues and conversations about this.
Thank you, Dr. Laura Minero. It was such a great honor to listen to you and learn and have that experience to bring this important topic and awareness for us to really connect with. So we really want to thank you for your time and commitment to this piece here today. If you can go to the next slide. And thank you everybody for attending today. I know Dr. Laura Minero talked about the resources, so please connect and go to the CARE website to access some of those resources as well. And also we're going to be putting in the chat right now, the feedback form. If you can actually please take the time to complete it. We really want to know your feedback and some suggestions as far as like what learning experience you had, or even for future, like, is there anything else that stood out to you that we need to focus on for the next time? So thank you so much. And we look forward to connecting with you, and please enjoy the rest of the conference and have a great afternoon. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Michael and Angela, for your support. We had a quieter group, but I'm so glad that we were able to connect. I can't hear you.
Great information. It's just, processing all of it. I loved every as a, listener, I was able to learn a lot of information. So I think it's that piece, but.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you. I know, I feel like it takes folks a minute to process, like, wow, that's a lot, and I'm really embedded like in the data and in this community. So yeah, I think oftentimes I get that like, oh wow, like I have to process this,
Yeah, and it's such a great great information. So it's really I'm very thankful for the bravery of the participants to be able to share or to learn, so we can learn from all of this. So
yes, absolutely. Well, thank you so much. I hope to
thank
see
you.
all
All
in the
right. So
future.
have a good rest of your afternoon. Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye,
Bye.
everybody.